6 former Vatican officials have been indicted for financial crimes, including embezzlement, money laundering, and extortion. How far does the corruption go? Editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, is here with analysis. Later, Pope Francis underwent colon surgery this week. How serious is his condition, and what is the prognosis for the 84-year-old? Surgeon and member of the Catholic Medical Association, Dr. Anthony Oliva, has some answers. And Communist China has imprisoned Catholic billionaire Jimmy Lai and shuttered his pro-democracy newspaper. What are the implications for freedom of speech? Irish entrepreneur and former candidate for the EU Parliament, DECLAN GANLEY, shares his thoughts. And critical race theory is appearing in school curricula across the U.S., even in some Catholic schools. Is it compatible with church teaching? Author Noëlle Mering has some answers. The World Over begins right now.
Now, Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. We have a great show for you tonight. If you'd like to comment, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. Lots to cover this evening. But first, some news. In Nigeria, suspected members of the Islamist terrorist group Boko Haram have kidnapped a Catholic priest. Father Elijah Wada was abducted as he traveled along a road on June 30th. Father Wada's diocese in Nigeria is asking for prayers for the priest's safe return. Since 2009, the West African nation has been destabilized as Boko Haram orchestrates attacks against religious and political targets. Nigeria's Catholic bishops are calling on their government to restore order and security. The Vatican announced on Saturday that Cardinal Becciu has been indicted by the Vatican court and will be tried on charges of embezzlement and abuse of office. As we previously reported, Becciu resigned as head of the Congregation for the Cause of Saints and relinquished all rights and privileges as a cardinal back in September of 2020. He also served as substituto of General Affairs at the Secretariat of State. The Pope personally gave the required approval last week for Becciu to be indicted. According to a 487-page request, Becciu is the most senior Vatican official to be tried for financial crimes before a Vatican court. Here with in-depth analysis of all of this and more, Editor-in-Chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal. Robert, thanks for being here. As this financial scandal continues to unfold, what are your thoughts on the Becciu indictment? I mean, this is pretty spectacular, also considering how close Becciu is to the Holy Father.
Yeah, it was quite shocking when the Holy Father asked him to step down and then also remove from him his perquisites as a cardinal. And as you say, it's been something like 300 years since a cardinal has been indicted by the Vatican itself for financial irregularities. This seems to be a very serious prosecution. There are 10 people who have been accused, not only him, but there are 9 others. According to reports, the bill of crimes runs to something like 500 pages, so it seems to be quite detailed. It's going to be interesting to me to see how much the Vatican is going to allow to appear in public from its private files, from which apparently it drew this. It drew this indictment. One of the oddities about this group, though, is that 2 of the people who have been indicted, Tommaso De Ruzza, who's an Italian, and a Frenchman, René Brulard, these 2 were the president and the executive of an authority that oversaw the Vatican Bank, not the real estate deal in Sloane Street in London, that seems to be the center of this investigation. So why they're included, if you wanted to be a conspiracy theorist, maybe it's to be able to exonerate some people and then convict others, or maybe there's some strange connection between them, even though they were not formally part of the oversight board for this particular part of the Vatican's operations. And then on top of all of that, since Becciu was the sostituto, the second in command, under Cardinal Parolin, the Secretary of State.
Right.
There seems to be some connection that could go that high. It would be very remarkable if it were to touch even Cardinal Parolin. And then there is the fact of Edgar Peña Parra, who replaced Becciu, who himself seems to have some hand in these matters. So the trial is going to start on July 27th. There's a lot that we're going to be following when that begins.
Yeah. Well, Bob, I think, good on the Pope for the transparency here and exposing even a friend to the proper indictments, considering his role in all this. But look, that London property at the center of this, as you mentioned, it was purchased by the Secretariat of State in stages between 2014 and 2018 from Italian businessman Raffaele Mincione. Now, at the time, he was managing hundreds of millions of euros in the Secretariat's funds. Mincione will also stand trial on charges of embezzlement and fraud and abuse of office. Cardinal Parolin was Cardinal Becciu's boss when the deal was underway, and he authorized the purchase of this London property. Why hasn't he been indicted? Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, that would be a real earthquake if the sitting Secretary of State at the Vatican were to be indicted by the Vatican itself. And I don't even know what mechanism would allow that to happen. I suppose the Holy Father himself would have to intervene at some point. Look, it's going to be a legitimate question when the evidence is being presented during this trial, how much Cardinal Parolin knew, and when did he know it, as we say here in Washington, right? The old joke. He could have signed off on it without knowing the specific details. The Secretary of State of the Vatican has wide responsibilities, of course. But it would be very odd for hundreds of millions of euros to go to a project without a Secretary of State, a responsible Secretary of State, looking very closely at what the deal entailed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, this case could get very interesting. We'll keep our eyes on it. I want to move on to a potentially more important story on the Pope's health. And I want to bring in a doctor to join us, Bob. This past Sunday, Pope Francis underwent surgery to treat colon diverticulitis. Now, how serious is this condition, and what are the recovery concerns for a Pope who's 84 years old? Here now to discuss is General Surgeon at St. Joseph's Health Hospital in Syracuse, New York, a member of the Catholic Medical Association, Dr. Anthony Oliva. Doctor, what exactly is diverticulitis, and how severe a condition do you think this is? I know you're diagnosing from afar, but your thoughts?
Diverticulitis is a pretty common condition. It basically arises when you get some inflammation surrounding the colon, particularly most commonly the last part of the colon, just proximal or upstream from the rectum. It arises from people who develop these pouches in their colon. That's called diverticulosis. 60% of people around age 80 may have these pouches, but only 5% end up needing surgery. And in this case, it sounds like, based on what I've read in the news, he's likely had long-standing disease that's been chronic. I don't ever recall him being hospitalized for an acute attack, but over time, that can lead to hypertrophy or a kind of stiffening of the colon wall, which can cause pain, cramping, difficulty in evacuating the bowels, and almost act like a partial obstruction. And when it gets to that stage, the only really good way to treat it is by surgery.
Yeah. And how severe and invasive is this surgery?
Well, typically they try and do it laparoscopically, or at least will start that way. And that involves smaller incisions, and you put in a camera inside the abdomen and remove the colon that way. But sometimes when the inflammation's severe, the tissue planes are obliterated, and it's very difficult to perform the operation laparoscopically because you lose the tactile sense. So you have to make a large incision so you can get your hands in there and palpate the structures. But in an 84-year-old, it is a risky proposition. Looking at the American College of Surgeons surgical risk calculator, risk of serious complication, the average risk is up to 15%. Any complication could be as high as 20%, including sepsis at 3.7. Death is pretty unusual. The average risk is only 0.6%. But infections 10%. So definitely you are concerned whenever you have an elderly patient undergoing this procedure. And that's assuming a healthy patient. I know the Pope has had some medical problems. I don't know exactly the full extent of them, but I know he does have some diminished lung capacity from a prior surgery.
The Pope was present at Sunday's Angelus last Sunday. He greeted people following the blessing, and the Vatican said the surgery was scheduled but was elective. However, there was no mention of it until Francis was already in the hospital. Your thoughts on the way the Vatican is sort of controlling the information about the Pope's health? Is that cause for concern?
It's really tough to know because this is a very serious condition. It would be hard to believe that he was delivering the Angelus and then all of a sudden he had to be admitted to the hospital for emergency surgery. That can happen where you require emergency surgery for diverticulitis, but typically it's in the setting of a perforation where you end up with peritonitis and you get deathly ill. If this has been something that's been ongoing, certainly it can be scheduled, but I think we see that everyone likes privacy when it comes to medical issues.
Yep. Doctor, the Vatican put out a statement this morning on the Pope's health. I want to read that in part. It says, His Holiness Pope Francis spent a quiet day, eating and moving unassisted. In the evening, he temporarily ran a temperature. The Holy Father is continuing with his planned treatment and eating by mouth. A fever is usually a sign of fighting off an infection, correct?
Yes, it can be. But looking at the time course from surgery, if he had the surgery on Sunday, the 4th, today's the 8th, so he's only 4 days out from surgery. It's pretty unusual to get a devastating complication that soon, especially if he's otherwise doing well. Commonly, people can have a little collapse of the lung bases called atelectasis from not deep breathing and coughing. More serious complications, usually the window you see that could be 1 to 2 weeks, but certainly you never want to blow off a fever or minimize it because that can be an indicator of a more serious underlying problem because this was a very complicated operation he underwent. Yeah, and particularly for someone his age. What do you make of that language that he's eating by mouth? They reinforced that twice in the statement. That must be a shake, right? He can't be processing hard foods at this point. Sometimes he can. It depends on how quickly his bowel function recovers and the extent of the surgery they had to do, and whether they, removed his colon and then they were able to. When you remove a segment of colon, you try and connect the two ends. Typically, what he had, it would involve bringing the colon down and connecting it to the rectum, which requires a little more time to heal. But I don't know the full extent of the operation he had or if he had anything else done. But once bowel function returns, moving your bowels or passing flatus, passing gas, then typically it's someone's otherwise doing well, it's safe to feed them.
Okay, final question. In a blog post this week, a Vatican insider, Luis Badia, who edits something called Il Sismografo, said that journalists and commentators are not doing the Pope any favors when they downplay the seriousness of this illness and the surgery, writing that, quote, the Holy Father will certainly return to the Vatican to resume his path in the footsteps of Peter, but he will never be the same again, end quote. Your reaction?
I don't know if that's entirely true. One thing I can say from taking care of elderly patients, that sometimes it can take them several weeks to months to get back to their baseline where they were functioning before surgery. But this is not, this is an illness that's been treated. It shouldn't come back. He should make a full recovery. It may take him some time. I know he occasionally is really limited by his sciatica. I'm not sure what his lung function's like, and he is 84, but I have no reason to think that if he does well from the surgery, he shouldn't make a complete recovery and be able to travel in the fall.
Yeah, that's my sense too. Pope Francis was expected to travel to Hungary and Slovakia in September. Do you think he'll be able to make it, or is that a bit too ambitious?
I think there's a good chance he can make it if he has an uneventful recovery without any complications. I don't see any reason why he wouldn't be able to travel.
Okay, Dr. Anthony Oliva, I thank you for the perspective there, the medical insight. It's, I think, important as we look at what's happening. Bob, I want to return to you. Pope Francis has indicated several times that he would resign the papacy if the time ever came where he thought he should. In an interview in 2015 with Mexican news outlet Televisa, Francis had this to say when asked about his papacy and if he would consider resigning like his predecessor. And he says here, "I have the feeling that my pontificate will be brief, 4 or 5 years. I do not know, even 2 or 3. Benedict should not be considered an exception, but an institution. Maybe he will be the only time for a long time, maybe he will not be, but an institutional door has been opened." In August of 2014, Pope Francis told reporters about retiring, "I think that a Pope Emeritus should not be an exception. You can ask me, what if one day you don't feel prepared to go on? I would do the same. I would do the same." And then he reiterated that during a homily in 2018. Bob, your take on all of this. Where do you see the Pope's health here? And do you think he would resign if he's facing complications?
Well, I think Dr. Oliva was right to be cautious about this. A lot of people are jumping to conclusions. That article in Il Sismografo, it's an odd word in Italian, Sismografo, says he'll never be the same. Today's LA Times is talking about he's in the hospital, but he's as much in charge as ever. There's a big headline. And so people who like him want to make, they want to believe that he's well. People who may have some criticisms, just believe that this is the beginning of the end, or they want to think that at least. My guess is we'll know fairly shortly if this is going along well or not. But the bigger question here, and this is something that several papacies now have faced, because we're all living longer. When people are living into their 80s and 90s, and no one thought that Benedict would live as long as he had. When he resigned, he was really exhausted. The Swiss guards were telling me he could barely walk. They had to wheel him down the main aisle at St. Peter's for masses. And yet, once the pressure of the papacy was off him, he's survived a long time. The questions now are going to be, and I don't think it's only a matter of would Pope Francis himself decide to resign? That day may come, and he seems to me to be level-headed enough that perhaps that would happen. The other question is, suppose he's incapacitated and he's unable to resign, or as sometimes happens with people who start to get dementia, gets very stubborn about things, and so who then would be able to make a decision? There needs to be. I think we've started to move toward that with the papacy of John Paul II, who himself had a tumor removed from his colon, and then of course had Parkinson's and a hip problem. I think we're going to have to face this problem as a church, what to do if a pope becomes incapacitated. Is there a committee, or is there a particular individual who decides that he's no longer capable of carrying out the functions and therefore a new pope has to be elected? This is going to come to a head in the church, and I think we'll see that probably sooner rather than later.
Yeah, the Vatican has been very guarded about information about the Pope's surgery. I mean, they announced it after he was already undergoing the surgery. This is sort of, though, the common playbook, the default position of the Vatican press operation, right?
Yeah, I have to commend them. At least there were no internal contradictions. At least the stories that we got, you and I have covered these things for a long time, Raymond, and we know that sometimes the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. This seemed to be fairly disciplined. It's sort of typical of the way that the Vatican handles these questions, that the Pope has the Angelus, and then sometime later all of a sudden pops up in a hospital where he's got a major operation going on. But I think I don't know why they do this. They keep talking about wanting to be transparent, and to be transparent in the modern world means to be much more forthcoming. It was entirely possible for them to have announced on Friday or Saturday that the Pope has to go in for this procedure. He's going to do the Angelus tomorrow. He's not on death's door. He's going to do that, and he's going to go over to the hospital. But for some reason, they like to hold this information very, very tight.
Bob, I have to move on, but we certainly pray for the Pope's recovery, and I know all of our viewers join us in that. I have to ask you about a recent op-ed in The Hill this week by John Kenneth White, former co-chair of Catholics for Biden. In his op-ed, he writes that the bishop's call for Eucharistic coherence is a first-class fiasco of their own making. White goes on to say that one of the reasons forcing the bishops to deal with this topic, forcing them in the first place, is, quote, the proliferation of conservative Catholic publications, such as First Things, and websites that include the National Catholic Register and LifeSite News. Like the bishops, these publications make abortion their preeminent priority. Besides these websites, EWTN, the Catholic cable channel, has become the go-to network for conservative Catholics. Raymond Arroyo's nightly The World Over program features his papal posse that is highly critical of Pope Francis. Okay, first of all, we are not critical of Pope Francis. We take his papacy seriously and analyze it as it comes. Secondly, we are not on nightly, though I'm delighted that our imprint is so large that it feels like it's nightly. And thirdly, I love how he charges the bishops and us with partisanship. Who's the person here who worked for the political campaign? That would be you, Professor John Kenneth White, Catholics for Biden board member, also a CUA professor. Bob, your thoughts?
Well, what makes me laugh about this, other than this impression that we're some sort of 900-pound gorilla that is able to pressure our bishops into doing something, is that the bishops have been virtually in lockstep with the Democrats on immigration, on poverty, on climate, all these issues. And it's not we who force their hands. It is the fact that we have a president claiming to be a devout Catholic who has been for years pushing issues like abortion, which is not, by the way, a question of the faith. It is a question of the natural law. It is not about sex. It is about violence. It's about killing human beings in the womb. And as for whether this is a fast-moving fiasco, the bishops, of course, have every possibility of creating a fiasco out of this. But like other people looking at the Pope and wanting it to be one thing or another, I think people like this, people like Professor White, would love this to become a fiasco. We'll see if it develops into one. But as far as I can see right now, these attacks are coming out precisely because this is a very serious critique that's being put to Catholic politicians out there in the public square. I said at our last posse that if the bishops only produce words and no action, well, then the words are nice, but still we haven't gotten anything further along. What I'd like to suggest they do is if they take a figure like Joe Biden or like Nancy Pelosi and speak to them privately, and they still persist in this stubborn refusal to enforce the natural law and follow church teaching, that they make a public statement that they have warned these people not to take communion. You often talk about Archbishop Rummel, who excommunicated people in New Orleans who were standing in the way of segregation and were racists. And that was real action taken by an American Catholic bishop to draw a line in the sand because we believe in certain things. I think the same sort of thing has to happen. It may be impossible to forbid these people from coming forward, but I think that it should at least be told, it should at least be said publicly that they've been told not to come forward, because otherwise our bishops show themselves to be toothless. The church cannot even enforce its own discipline on Catholics.
Yeah, well, and you've nailed it right there. The church's own discipline. It doesn't come from a website or a political party. This is canon law. It's in the canon law. The church, this is the church's belief and doctrine and what it means to be in communion. So it doesn't matter whether I'm saying it or somebody else is saying it or that guy over there saying it. That's all just atmospherics. The canon law requires that one live in continuity with this body of teaching to be considered in communion. That's all. It's very simple. In response to the USCCB's decision to move forward on creating a draft document on Eucharistic coherence, President Biden's parish, Holy Trinity in Washington, D.C., released this statement. Holy Trinity Catholic Church will not deny the Eucharist to persons presenting themselves to receive it. As the Holy Trinity Parish Council, we stand with our Archbishop, Cardinal Wilton Gregory, concerning the issues surrounding offering the Eucharist to American politicians. The recent vote has caused considerable desolation among our parishioners, as well as Roman Catholics throughout the nation. Desolation among the parishioners, Bob. As we've said repeatedly, there will be nothing new in the document that's not already widely understood. Do you expect we'll see more of this from parishes across the country or parish councils?
Well, probably, but the Biden parish here in Washington is well known to be a liberal parish. I don't want to accuse anybody of heresy, but liberal parishes, tend to go their own way on a variety of different issues. Many of them, I have the suspicion, don't even believe in the real. A lot of people in those parishes don't even believe in the real presence. We have statistics to support that. I would actually like to see the opposite. I would like to see bishops across the country do what I just mentioned, and that is tell politicians privately at first, counsel them, be pastoral. But if they persist in public scandal, I mean, that's the thing that Canon 915 in particular points toward. This isn't just you or I privately having an opinion that may be skewed away from Catholic truth. It's being a public figure who's causing scandal and is misleading people about what the faith is. So I would like to see bishops individually, because they can only do this individually within their own diocese, come out and then point to particular people who've been warned. My friend Cardinal George in Chicago, before he died, had Dick Durbin, Senator Dick Durbin, in multiple times. I used to tell him that he ought to take further steps, and for various reasons he couldn't or wouldn't. But I think the time now is to move beyond this sort of stalemate that we've had, where we say the right things, but there's no further follow through. We need what one of my writers at the Catholic thing, Father Timothy Vavrick, called pastoral coherence to correspond with the Eucharistic coherence.
No, we've reached a point where, though people say you're weaponizing and politicizing the Eucharist, what's actually happening is people are trying to frame this as politics and as partisanship, as a way of restraining the church law and what's required by the church. So we'll see how this plays out, but it's going to be quite a battle. Pope Francis has agreed to meet with indigenous leaders later this year in Canada, Bob, to discuss a possible visit to apologize for the church's role in operating residential schools. Now, these church-run institutions were found to have abused and forcibly assimilated generations of indigenous children. In the last few weeks, at least 5 Catholic churches in Canada have been set ablaze and vandalized in retaliation. Canada's First Nations leaders have explicitly condemned the violence, but not a word from the Vatican. What's going on here, Bob?
Well, look, this is a complicated situation. These so-called residential schools in Canada were actually founded by the Canadian government. And the Canadian government asked not only the Catholic Church, we keep hearing about the Catholic Church, but we're kind of used to, being the whipping boy for things like this. But it was not only the Catholic Church, it was Protestant denominations. Canada is other than certain parts of Canada, is very Protestant. They too were running these residential schools. Now, there have been what are being called mass graves found around these various schools. Those schools operated for decades upon decades. We don't know why those children died. Was there some abuse? No doubt there probably was. Was there probably some improper attempt to assimilate? But then again, assimilation means bringing people into the mainstream. You can still have your indigenous culture. And by the way, many of the people in those churches that were burned are still indigenous people who went to those residential schools.
Right.
I've talked with some of my Canadian friends, and they say there's been no investigation into how these children died, what this actually means. What this really is, in my judgment, is it's a rush to blame this on the Catholic Church, spare the Canadian government before we know anything at all. It could be that these Catholic orders were at fault, but we don't know that for a fact. This is sort of painting, as the Roman historian Tacitus did, that the Christians are the enemy of the human race because we don't go along with what the rest of the culture is doing. I think that it's an outrage. Some of my friends in Canada tell me it's more actually Antifa types rather than native indigenous peoples who are burning these churches. And so we want to, I noticed that Pope Francis has been a little slow to react to this idea that that the church should apologize. And I assume that's because he's getting information that we need to wait until there's some investigations done. There could be criminality here. It could be something much less serious than that.
Bob, we'll leave it there. Thank you, as always, for your commentary. Robert Royal's ongoing commentary can be found at thecatholicthing.org. Thanks, Bob. The Chinese Communist government recently celebrated its 100th anniversary with great fanfare, despite conducting a genocide against Uyghur Muslims and imprisoning Catholic pro-democracy activist Jimmy Lai. Meanwhile, the UK and Ireland remain under COVID lockdowns that are still in some places rather severe. Joining me now to discuss all of this and more is Irish businessman, telecom entrepreneur, and activist DECLAN GANLEY. Thanks for joining us, DECLAN. I want to begin with China. The communist government has imprisoned Catholic media tycoon Jimmy Lai since last year. They shuttered his Hong Kong newspaper, Apple Daily, arrested most of his staff. They've effectively silenced the voice of freedom in Hong Kong and really throughout China. In June, just prior to the shutdown of the paper, the Wall Street Journal wrote this of Jimmy Lai: as Chinese Communist Party seeks to expand its political control over critics worldwide, often with the acquiescence of Hollywood and U.S. tech companies, Jimmy Lai speaks for everyone fighting for the cause of liberty. DECLAN, you're a personal friend of Mr. Lai. How critical is his struggle against the CCP, and why is it vitally important to the rest of the world?
It's enormously critical, Raymond. Jimmy Lai is becoming something of a St. Thomas More of China. He is going through a white martyrdom right now. He and his wife, Teresa, his family are going through immense suffering for the cause of freedom, the cause of democracy, and for his faith. Because Jimmy's courage, his fortitude is underpinned by his faith, his Catholic faith. And the fact that the Communist Party of China have gone to the lengths that they have gone to crack down on Jimmy, to cast him into prison, to destroy his business, to put Apple Daily out of business in Hong Kong, seize their bank accounts, stop them from printing, as you said, the last voice of freedom in Hong Kong, that underlines how important Jimmy Lai is to the Communist Party of China. They see him as an existential threat, because if they didn't, they would leave him alone. That's how effective even a single voice in defense of freedom like Jimmy is in standing up to the tyranny of the Communist Party of China.
DECLAN, this year, Lai was awarded the Gwen Ifill Press Freedom Award by the Committee to Protect Journalists. This is a pretty important honor. Why does it seem that freedom of the press is in jeopardy, not only in obvious places like communist China, but across many of the Western democracies?
It's very worrying. It's a trend that we've now seen that's been going on for years. In the case of the Communist Party of China, it's a trend that they have exploited. We need the contest of ideas. We need to be able to speak freely and to talk about, obviously, things that affect democracy, that affect our faith, to exercise religious freedom in the public square, etc. Why are we seeing this trend towards shutting it down? Because vested interests, crony corporatists, moneyed interests that are not interested in competition or in being challenged, with ideas that are outside of the narrow frame within which they want the world to be seen and defined. They want to restrict and limit the outlets for ideas that challenge this consensus. And that consensus ever more suits the Communist Party of China and its agenda, which is to restrict freedom in the world, extend their own power. So none of this is serving any of us well.
In recent days, we've heard a lot about censorship by social media sites like Twitter, Facebook. Facebook's encouraging users to report other users who might become radicalized. Twitter recently suspended an account of New Zealand China expert Anne-Marie Brady, who has been critical of the Chinese Communist Party. Her suspension has since been overturned. But DECLAN, from your perspective in the media business, why do these social media outlets seem to be more than willing to censor opposing opinions or broader opinions, particularly when it comes to China, and how dangerous is this path we're headed down?
Well, I think the trend towards the kind of censorship that we've seen in social media is fed by two things. One, it's fed by the pools that they are recruiting from that tend to lean in one particular direction. Politically, not exclusively, but they tend to lean in that direction, and money. That is to say that the the addiction that so many large corporations have is to the cash flow that they can generate by being given access to the market that the Communist Party of China currently control. That's the largest market in the world in terms of potential consumers, and it's frightening what some crony corporates, what large corporations, including media corporations, are willing to do, the blind eyes that they're willing to turn when it comes to what it takes to be given access to the Chinese marketplace. And I think that those are all factors that are influencing what I will call editorial decisions that are being made in these companies, companies that should be making no editorial decisions whatsoever. If they want to make editorial decisions, they should be subject to the same defamation laws, accountability, and everything else globally that everybody else in the media is. There cannot be one rule for them and other rules for others.
Former U.S. President Donald Trump announced a class action lawsuit this week against big tech throughout the country. Take a look at this. I want your reaction.
We're demanding an end to the shadow banning, a stop to the silencing, and a stop to the blacklisting, banishing, and canceling that you know so well. In addition, we are asking the court to impose punitive damages on these social media giants. We're going to hold big tech very accountable.
Declan, your thoughts. These bans aren't just about criticism of China, but concern any viewpoint contrary to the orthodoxy of the moment. And as Trump went on to say, the target could be anyone, including a president.
So, I mean, we saw in the run-up to the last election, we saw one of the oldest newspapers in America, the New York Post, being banned from Twitter. Its account was shut. They were denied access to their Twitter account, which, you know, whatever you think, whatever your political views are, that one of America's oldest and most prominent newspapers is shut down from a platform like Twitter it was stunning to me. It was shocking. And we have to allow, coming back to the point I made a little bit earlier, these are supposed to be neutral, open access platforms, freely available to anybody that's not, you know, a terrorist, to be able to have free access and express their opinions on. There's something wrong when mullahs in Iran who call for the destruction of Israel and all sorts of other things, who are very much the antithetical to, if you like, the modern agenda, where their Twitter accounts are and social media accounts are allowed to stay up, while we see others operated by people who are democratically accountable, who are open and active in the public square, where we see them get shut down. So we need these companies to be subject to laws and to rules that level the playing field, because we cannot have people who are unaccountable making editorial decisions that are denying large numbers of people now free access to the public square. When you own the public square, you are responsible for keeping it free, and if you are starting to block access to it, you need to be held up to account, and legislation needs to be passed to ensure that that happens if necessary.
Well, we've seen in recent months that these social media giants, they just expand the definition of hate speech or misinformation, including things that now we know are entirely true about vaccine reactions, hydroxychloroquine, and some of these therapeutics that were damned at the beginning when they were first announced. And now we find out actually could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. So it does beg the question, who's vetting it? Who's in charge of deciding this idea is worthy, that one is misinformation? We've got to have a public conversation about that. And speaking of social and political orthodoxy, the EU is now threatening the nation of Hungary with the full force of EU law if it fails to repeal a new law banning the promotion of homosexuality in Hungary's schools. Watch.
If Hungary doesn't set things right, the Commission will use the powers invested in it as the guardian of the treaties. Let's be clear. We will use these powers whichever member state impedes European law.
Declan, you've waded into EU politics yourself. What do you make of this threat? Some at the EU want to withhold COVID funds until Hungary complies.
Raymond, I am very fearful, and I've been very concerned for more than a decade now, that the direction that the EU is headed in is going to unleash centrifugal forces, and is unleashing centrifugal forces that will end up blowing the European Union apart. And some people might say, well, that would be a welcome development, but I wouldn't be one of them, because putting Humpty Dumpty back together again will probably take another couple of centuries and at least one more big war, and I would rather not have to go through that. The fact that the EU did not reform itself from the bottom up, did not make its institutions properly democratically accountable, did not go through the reforms that it should have done, and instead forced through the Lisbon Treaty formula, which I opposed at the time, set in course a series of events that resulted in Brexit. And that's a controversial thing for me to say back in Europe, but it's true. If that had been addressed at the time, if those reforms had been done, I do not believe the circumstances that led to Brexit would have taken place. Furthermore, when we see countries in the Visegrad group, which is the group of Eastern European countries, one of which includes Hungary, of course, when they are taking positions that are out of step with what is fashionable in Brussels at the moment, and Brussels oversteps its domain, whether it's, what it's doing with Hungary right now, or whether what's going on with Ireland with regard to its tax sovereignty and corporate tax rates. Right. These attacks on issues that are sovereign, that are the responsibility of the nation states that make up the European Union, when you apply these pressures, be it on Ireland over corporate taxation, be it on Hungary over these family laws, those create pressures and feed anti-European sentiments in all of these countries that create more facies and a greater tendency, not for Europe to come together on things that we need to work together on, but for Europe to get blown apart. We need elites globally. We need elites to be elite again. Whether it's allowing media, consensus, and groupthink to get so stupid to the point that you have made that we can't even discuss science properly anymore, where we end up seeing months and months of COVID propaganda that is false, that is unscientific, when the Wuhan lab theory is considered a conspiracy theory, something that the dogs in the streets a year ago knew was the most likely source of what happened. When these things are denied to ordinary people, when things that are plain for people who don't have a third-level education, may not even have a second-level education, but things that are plainly false are proffered as being truth, who can expect anybody to trust elite institutions? We need to make elites elite again. We need institutional reform, and we have to stop being really obviously stupid and embarrassing ourselves in front of Europe, in front of the United States. We need to start getting the big things right again, and we've not been doing that for too long. And the media, ultimately, it's their responsibility and their solemn duty to hold all sides to account and to allow all ideas to get debated in the public square.
Yeah. Before we run out of time, I have to touch on the COVID lockdowns in the UK and your native Ireland. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has announced that the lockdowns should be relaxed as of July 19th. Northern Ireland will relax its pandemic restrictions slightly beginning July 26th. Now, the COVID status of the Republic of Ireland, where you reside, is another story. The reopening there has been postponed indefinitely, according to some media reports. Give me a sense of where things stand. And I know you sued over public worship last year. What's the state of all of that?
So the state of the public worship case, so there was the longest ban in the world, apart from North Korea and Saudi Arabia, on Christian public worship was in the Republic of Ireland, believe it or not. And that ran for months. So we first started taking a case on that in October of last year. We have not yet been able to get to trial. We have a case hearing this week in the High Court in Ireland on the question of mootness, that is whether or not the trial can even go ahead because has it been timed out because so much time has elapsed since we first took it, and some of those bans have subsequently been lifted. But in Ireland, for example, right now, First Holy Communions are banned, confirmations are banned, weddings are limited to 20 people, funerals are limited to 20 people. There are pretty onerous restrictions on the number of people that can go to Mass in a church or even in a cathedral. And the dialogue between the government and the leadership of the Catholic Church in Ireland has been appalling. The government announces things on Twitter without speaking with the leadership of the Catholic Church. Archbishop Eamon Martin, the head of the Catholic Church in Ireland, decried this last week in the Irish media. And then we have this insane lockdown scenario in Ireland where indoor dining is banned indefinitely. So our small, the Irish pubs, family restaurants, cafes, etc., are being put out of business in their thousands upon thousands. The tourism is being destroyed in Ireland, and all of the jobs that depend on it. So there's carnage going on in the economy because of these lockdowns. There is this body of experts, of medical experts called NPHET, we call them, NPHET in Ireland. They seem to be running the country. They make announcements. They don't even liaise with the government anymore before making announcements. They simultaneously release stuff on Twitter and tell the government at the same time what's going on. We are being run by a bunch of unaccountable, unelected experts who have a very narrow focus. I mean, there were 60,000 people at the football match between England and Denmark in Wembley Stadium. In Ireland, that's just not allowed to happen. Ireland actually just cancelled the games that it was supposed to have in these European Championships. They just banned all of them. They've banned the Dublin City Marathon, which was due to happen in October, by which time everyone in Ireland will be vaccinated. Silverstone's Grand Prix, the big motorsport event in the UK, is happening in a few weeks' time. There's going to be 140,000 people at that, and yet we can't have the Dublin City Marathon at the end of October. So it's crazy. Crazy is the word. It's psychotic at this point. That's what it is.
Well, Declan, I hope things open up there. We will check in with you for the latest. Thank you for being here. And you can follow Declan Ganley on Twitter at Declan Ganley. Thank you so.
Thank you, Raymond.
Noelle Mering is next, but first, healthcare workers in the state of Ohio now have conscience protection rights. Republican Governor Mike DeWine signed a budget bill into law on June 30th that includes conscience protections for medical professionals. Doctors, healthcare workers, hospitals, and insurers can now decline to participate or perform or pay for any healthcare service that violates their deeply held religious beliefs. Critics say the legislation could lead to medical discrimination against LGBTQ Ohioans.
Mark my words, our union will defend any member who gets in trouble for teaching honest history. We have a legal defense fund ready to go, and we are preparing for litigation as we speak.
That was Randi Weingarten. She's the president of the American Federation of Teachers, speaking to members announcing legal protection for teachers accused of pushing critical race theory. As woke ideology is infiltrating secular schools across the country, our next guest says it's becoming a poison in Catholic schools as well. Here now is the author of the new book, Awake, Not Woke, A Christian Response to the Cult of Progressive Ideology, Noelle Mering. Thanks for being here, Noelle. I want to start with critical race theory and the controversy surrounding it. For those who don't know, what exactly is critical race theory, and why is it making its way into Catholic schools?
Well, critical race theory is basically founded in critical theory applied to racial grievances. It began in the late 80s, early 90s in law schools from the father of the movement is named Derek Bell, and then was disseminated further through Kimberly Crenshaw and her pivotal essay, Mapping the Margins. but it was never meant to remain in the ivory towers of academia. And I think this is partially where the confusion lies, is that it was always meant to be a means of activism and furthering a specific ideology aimed at revolution. So though it began as an academic roots, it has since disseminated and is manifested and called euphemistically things like equity, diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism. These are all not specifically perfectly aligned with CRT. However, they are natural outgrowth of this ideology that has the same aims and has the same filter, seeing all of society through a lens of power.
Mm-hmm. And it's certainly all over the public curricula. I mean, you discuss the difference between critical thinking and critical theory in your new book. Explain the difference, and how does critical theory end up supporting Marxist ideology?
Well, so the difference is what their ends are. The end of critical thinking is to arrive at the truth. So the critical thinker invites objections, invites debate for the sake of arriving at their truest possible conclusion. Critical theory has a very different end. The end of critical theory is power and activism. So the means of achieving power and activism are not going to be inviting criticism, but rather silencing criticism, silencing dissent, coercion, and also eventually tyranny and control. So if they have very different ends and form the different means that they deploy, and one is oriented towards the truth, the other one is really oriented towards domination.
The American Federation of Teachers at their conference this week featured Dr. Ibram Kendi. He offered this analysis. Listen.
We live in a dangerously racist society. There are racist ideas that are swirling around that are teaching darker skinned kids that there's something wrong with them because of the color of their skin. There are ideas that are swirling around teaching white kids that there's something right about them because of the color of their skin.
Noelle, where are kids being taught this exactly?
Well, it's incredibly deceptive and pretty ironic because DEI and anti-racism training has famously taught through such establishments as the Smithsonian Museum and also DEI training in New York education public school system, that such virtues as being on time, hard work, objective reasoning, rational thought, politeness are all white virtues. These are incredibly racist things to be teaching students, teachers, and communities. So that they are on record teaching these racist things that are prompting white progressive parents in recent studies to believe that Black people are less capable than what Black people see in themselves, so disempowering the Black community and incredibly racist in principle. So I don't see the evidence of where the conservative schools or even non-anti-racist ideological communities are teaching such racist things, although racism certainly will continue to be a problem. But they are the ones who are actually teaching institutionalized racism through their ideology.
Look, the idea we should be putting forth is every child is a child of God, and we should not focus on externals, but on the heart of individuals, what they do, what they say. Evil resides in the heart of man, not in his skin color. And I think if we taught that more and stop making everybody so overly sensitive and sensitized to externals, maybe we'd get a lot further in race relations. Maybe. In a recent column, you discuss how parents at a Catholic school in Chicago voiced concerns that woke ideology was being inserted in all aspects of their children's education. Now, does anyone even care about what these parents are saying? Are they listening?
Well, it's still to be determined. The parents have certainly erected a strong fight. They've started a website, and they really are loyal to the school deeply. They want to see the school walk the right road. So that they've had a certain amount of pushback, and there are certain aspects of the administration that have expressively said that this is the road that they're committed to, and the parents who are not on board have to get off the ship. So excuse the mixed analogies, but so there is certainly some intransigence that they're seeing, but they still are very hopeful that they can help the school and reform and also return to the unified community that they have always been as a mixed race school with diverse socioeconomic backgrounds. They've always been very unified, very committed to upholding and helping every student at the school. And this divisive ideology has begun segregating them and introducing certain notions of grievances that they didn't feel, and including lower socioeconomic families of darker skin color who are now considered oppressors because because they're Hispanic, for example, or Asian, and they're looking at their multi-million-dollar friends and saying, I don't feel that I'm oppressing you. This doesn't make sense. Why is our friendship being eroded in this way? So it's incredibly toxic.
Wow. In your new book, you write that woke ideology assaults church teaching. How so, Noelle?
Well, I think it fundamentally preaches an anti-gospel. So the church defines the nature of a human person based on the love of God, that we are his sons and daughters, and that we are therefore brothers and sisters. And our mission in life is to spread the good news that we are loved deeply and known. And the woke ideology defines the human person based on the oppression of society, either in proximity to it by being a perpetrator or by being a victim. So if oppression is the root, the very definition of who you are, your message then is to go spread the news to other people that not that they are loved, but that they are hated. And I think we see this clearly in the way in which a woman who is pro-life, for example, will not she'll be considered not fully living out her womanhood. She won't be allowed to walk with an official affiliation with a women's march, and because she doesn't accept abortion. And this is a sign that it's not merely about empowering women or minorities or homosexuals, but rather about furthering an agenda based on oppression and power narratives.
So far, about 25 states, Noelle, have considered legislation or taken other steps to limit how race and racism can be taught, according to analysis by Education Week. Now, teachers and educators argue that they know the best way to teach their students, not politicians or even parents. Your thoughts?
Well, I think this is a sign that something is greatly amiss, because the parents have become the enemies of the school and the teachers in many schools now. They have divergent missions for the children. So the parents largely are saying we want our children to learn about the evils of racism. We want them to know what Jim Crow laws were and about the evils of slavery. That's not all that they're doing. But when you challenge the school on it, they'll say, retreat to these things. You just don't want to know the history. However, what they're dissembling on is the fact that they are actually inserting a whole ideology that totalizes half-truths and creates a filter for the students in which they are segregated, trying to resolve segregation through further segregation. And the thing that underlying that is that there's no universal human principle of how we behave with one another, that we ought to behave differently based on immutable characteristics of ourselves. And it really refutes any potential for our perception of sort of a brotherhood and sisterhood that I think we are called to have as human beings, called to one common family ultimately.
I agree. You know, I hazarded the idea the other day. What children really need is to look at great American lives, Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, and the contributions of each of those people, so that we're not leading with the differences, but leading with the glories of American history. I mean, nobody talks about John Adams being not only a founding father and a dead white guy, but also an abolitionist who defended the rights of freed slaves and tried to free others. I mean, the complexity of history is lost in this kind of generalization, as you said, canonizing half-truths. I read a piece this week suggesting that critical race theory is compatible with Catholicism and Catholic teaching. And the thesis was, look, race is what divides us, so race has to be the lens through which we seek justice. How would you respond to that?
Well, it's an incredibly unnuanced view, for one thing. It collectivizes individuals and makes sin and love something abstract. Whereas we know in the Catholic faith that my sins are mine, and my ability to love and call to love is also mine to respond to. I can't abstract virtue into being part of a certain movement, or abstract sin into being part of a certain group. So I think that these are incredibly destructive things to introduce and to think that they can coexist with Christ. I truly believe and talk about in my book that this movement is fundamentally an attack on God. It's an attack on reason, on human nature, and authority. And it supplants all those things with chaos and human power. It's fundamentally anti-logos. And I think it will ride on the residue of a waning Christianity until it has replaced it, unless we stop it. But we need clarity in order to see that, because it operates a great deal on confusion.
Noelle, I thank you for your insight and your clarity. Awake, Not Woke, A Christian Response to the Cult of Progressive Ideology by Noelle Mering is available at bookstores everywhere and online and at EWTNRC.com. Noelle, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
That is all the time we have for now. Be sure to catch us next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo. Bye now.